I'm going to let our distinguished panel members introduce themselves. Don?
I'm Don Kettle, and I'm Professor of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, former Dean there, and in fact I tell people I'm the Dean Recovery Program. The third and 12th step, or the third step is admit you have an email problem, and I'm working on it hard. Making some progress on it, I think, and I am glad to be with you today. This is really, I think, a path-breaking effort.
And I'm Lisa Danzig. I am the Associate Director for the Performance and Personnel Management team at OMB on the management side, for those of you who are familiar with OMB components. I've been there for about a year, and I was at HUD for the 5 years prior to that as the Director of the Office of Strategic Planning and Management and the Performance Improvement Officer. So excited to be here and tell some stories.
I'm Kate Josephs. You know me. The one thing, for those of you who don't know, that's maybe worth knowing is that prior to coming over to the US and becoming a federal employee, I worked in the UK government and was, among other things, in my career, Deputy Director of a thing called the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, which I guess is the closest thing we had to a kind of national stat programme in the UK under the previous Labour government in the UK. So our task today, our three tasks today, is to really try and think about the way that this concept of storytelling has been used, either intentionally or unintentionally, in our world of performance management and performance improvement. And the first kind of question I wanted us to discuss is when we think about performance management and performance improvement, the idea of data-driven reviews or stat programs is a really kind of central tenet. And the question for me is, what place does storytelling have in those kinds of worlds? I'm going to hand to Don first. For those of you who've seen the program, I've completely shamelessly stolen the title of one of the stories that Don's going to tell to make our panel sound more exciting. So, Don, tell us about rats in Baltimore.
My story is about rats, and before I get started, let me just see, are there any friends of rats here? Anybody?
You might.
Is it working? Let's try this. Is this better? Okay, sounds good. So I just want to check. Friends of rats, we have one or two here, I think. For the most part, rats are bad things, and most people in most places want to get rid of them, and they expect their government to help them do it. In Baltimore, they have a program which has probably the single best name of any program anywhere. It's called the Rat Rub-Out Program, whose mission it is to rub out rats. And the way it works is that if you have problems with rats in your neighborhood, you pick up the phone, you dial 311 to the city's information collection complaint line. You say, I live at, give your address, and I've got rats. And what the city does is as part of its CityStat program, it tabulates the calls that come in so that it gets identification of where the rat problems are located. And then it maps them. So it takes the individual calls and then aggregates them to a mapping program that shows where the rats are located. And it turns out that there are, not surprisingly, hotspots about where the rat problems are located. I had a group of foreign visitors one time. I said, okay, now what do we do now? Who's in charge of cleaning up the rats? And somebody put up their hand and said, the Department of Rats? And that is, of course, precisely the wrong answer. There is no Department of Rats. There should not be a Department of Rats because you don't want to create a new departmental program and a new agency for every problem that develops. It turns out that the problem of rats is a problem of, well, think about it, housing, sanitation, transportation to some degree, water and sewer, public health, you can go on. It turns out that there's not one agency, but several that have to be responsible for cleaning up the problem of rats. And only by working together are they likely to make any progress. And so if you're the mayor and you say, look, I want to try to do something about the problem of rats, you can have the calls that come in to track how well you're doing. You have the maps to tell you where you need to work. You have the agencies you can identify that are a piece of the action. And then you have a way to be able to follow through on the progress that you're making by whether or not on the maps that the spots get bigger or smaller. And it turns out the city of Baltimore has made substantial progress in reducing its rat population by using the stat process to create not only the story, because rats are bad, with apologies to those of you who are rat defenders out there, but they also tend to be markers for housing problems, substandard housing problems, water and sewer, garbage problems. And it's not a problem that any one agency can solve, but agencies working together can make progress on. They've made progress, but on top of that, on top of everything else, if you step back and ask yourself, what is it that the rat story is really all about? It's about telling a story to illustrate the power of citizen contact, 311 programs, geographic information systems, interagency coordination, mayoral leadership, all illustrated by something that everybody agrees we ought to do, which is to rub out rats.
So I'm going to try and one-up Don and talk about salmonella in New York City. Just to continue
Bigger
with the
city,
theme.
worse problem.
The theme. Can I see from a show of hands anyone who's been sick from salmonella? Oh dear. I was hoping to not see very many hands go up. So a slightly different version of story, but thinking about the video that we saw that opened us up in terms of seeing a story on one end of the spectrum and report on the other end. How do you take data that can be very dry or something that people aren't paying attention to and try and get people to understand what it is and make decisions based on it? So before I joined HUD, I was in New York City, the housing department, the mayoral agency that managed affordable housing. And this wasn't directly related to the work I did there, but I observed this happening in the Bloomberg administration, and many of you who probably traveled through New York are aware of this, that health inspectors would go into restaurants and often come up with a catalog or a checklist of things that the restaurants were doing or not doing well. Whether they had, any rodents were seen, if cockroaches were spotted, if there was open food, raw food, et cetera, refrigeration, employees washing their hands, et cetera. And I think for many, many years, this had been reported to the restaurants and with some success in terms of compliance or responsiveness in terms of trying to address it. But it wasn't until that big kind of laundry list and checklist of information was translated into essentially a story that the public could understand and have some relative point of comparison through an A, B, C, D, F rating that was posted transparently on the windows of restaurants. Did it turn into a real behavior change? So you could see on every eating establishment the letter grade that the restaurant had in the front window. And it was pretty incredible to see in the news when a very fancy restaurant that there were weeks and weeks of waiting to get a reservation was suddenly getting a B or a C. And there was a scurry of activity to try and address that because clearly this wasn't good for brand, this wasn't good for marketing. And I think is a powerful way to think about not a single decision maker, but when you think about kind of a catalog of information or checklist of lots and lots of data points, how you assemble that in something that's meaningful and communicate that in something that's meaningful to the user. And in this case was communicated, I think, by creating a relative comparison using this color or the schema that we all are familiar with from grade school in terms of an A through F rating. And then being transparent about that in terms of showing that to users who could then make choices. If you'll allow me, I have one other example that's a little closer to home that relates to HUD and to the decision maker in terms of the federal level, which I think might be more specific to where you guys are all sitting. And that is in our work to try and figure out if we could house more people at HUD. Well, when we were establishing our high priority performance goals, or now called agency priority goal, to try and figure out what we could do at the beginning of the first term of this administration. HUD provides affordable housing. That seems like a pretty straightforward idea. And our secretary, Sean Donovan at the time, really wanted to know how many more people we could try and house by becoming more efficient and more effective, even if we weren't adding additional resources. And at the moment, we were counting the number of public housing units that were created, or the number of affordable housing units that were created, but we didn't have a good way of looking, or we weren't really focused on the occupancy rate. So I think the feedback and general sentiment was, well, at HUD, we really just control the creation of the unit. We don't control, the landlords are the ones who control whether or not there's a household actually in the unit. And when we started to focus more on the occupancy rate, which we had been tracking but not paying as much attention to, we started shifting the conversation from, did the unit get created, to, is somebody actually living in it? And that shifted the behavior then to, how do we ensure that when someone moves out, we can have someone move in relatively quickly? How do we ensure that units aren't offline all the time? And how do we make sure that we're really serving as many people as we can with the limited resources that we have? And over the course of 2 years, we went from an 89% occupancy, which is relatively high if you think about some of private sector apartment buildings, to 97% within public housing, because we were focused on this number and because that was changing some of the behavior then in terms of what we were doing. So a similar story, I think, in terms of taking data, and we had a kind of laundry list of data points we could look at to try and figure out how many people we were housing in affordable housing, and translating that into something that was more meaningful so that the people on the front lines in the 3,000 or some public housing entities could really think about, oh, that's what we're aiming for. I get that, and I have some control over that because I can control how quickly we're going to fix the bathroom when somebody's moved out. And so translating, I think, the kind of flat report side of the equation into the story and actually helping a person or the outcome, I think, can be very powerful.
Thank you. My example, so I'm going to bring an example from my time in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, and it's actually also about housing, but I think it's a little bit about how taking the time to uncover the story within the data can also be incredibly valuable when we're working with senior decision makers. So around the time of the economic crisis in 2008, as here in the US, we had a huge problem in the UK around foreclosure, or as we call it in the UK, repossessions. So people losing their house, not unable to pay their mortgage, and a real spike in those kind of numbers, and a real huge social problem as a result of it. And so the government, and in all of our wisdom, decided to create a program, because that's what we do, right? And the program was designed in collaboration with local government and with the banks and the mortgage lenders, and it was all about essentially providing a sort of government support, government funding to enable people to continue to either to have support to pay their mortgage, or to have a little bit of breathing space from their lender, or in some cases to convert their home to a kind of joint locally owned private, so essentially to have the local authority come in and help support the payment, so they didn't have to leave their home. What was interesting was that very quickly it became apparent that nobody was using this program. So the repossessions numbers, the foreclosures numbers were going up, and the numbers of homes actually availing themselves of this program were going down. And so the Prime Minister was very concerned, ministers were very concerned, and the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, where I worked, was asked to try and work out what was going on. And so we did lots and lots of data crunching, we did lots of talking to lots of people, and it was only actually when we went out and found a way of trying to get at the voice of the people who were affected by this terrible situation, the people who were losing their homes, that we kind of realized what was going on. And we weren't able to speak to people, honestly, who were at risk of losing their homes, but we spent a lot of time talking to voluntary financial advisors, so people out in the community who work with people who are in having financial difficulties. And what we heard from them was a resounding and kind of overwhelming get real. You have this program, that's great, but you are asking people who are frankly in denial in most cases, who have their heads in the sand, who will not open any mail because they're terrified that it's going to be another bill or another potential letter from the bank saying we're going to come and evict you. And so you're communicating with them in completely the wrong way. And why that was powerful were two things. Firstly, it was about helping us understand what's the story behind the data, but also it was just a really incredibly powerful way of going back to the Prime Minister and back to the senior decision makers and putting the problem in terms that they could understand and relate to and think, oh, my constituents, the people who live in the town that I represent, I can see these people in these stories. And it was about marrying that really robust data with some I hate to use the word anecdote, but a little bit of anecdote, to be honest, to help them have the confidence that actually what they needed to do was not throw more money at the problem or mandate more things from the centre. It was actually about being really creative about the way we reached out to these people and worked in partnership, particularly with voluntary providers and with local delivery partners in the front line to try and reach these people. So that's my kind of story. So there's some stories of story. The second thing I wanted to talk about, kind of building on from that, is for those of us who like data and care about data and think about data a lot, there is inevitable critique that we never want policy to be made on the basis of anecdote, and that's a real risk, right? We don't want to have anecdote driving policy and implementation. What are your perspectives on how one goes about ensuring the right balance and the right layering between data and narrative when you're trying to package information for a stat meeting or for a data review, or just to try and get a decision made?
So I think of Anecdote as a very useful tool in terms of developing hypotheses. So I'll just give a very simple example that's in my recent work. One of the things I work on in my role is thinking about our senior leadership, SES, and how we can strengthen the SES. So you hear a lot of anecdotes, especially from federal employees, about working in federal government. And I think of, you'd hear an anecdote, we hire everybody from within the government. We don't ever bring anyone in from outside. It might be something that someone would say. And there'd be some anecdote about somebody recently hired within the organization that was handpicked before anyone ever was aware the job was created. And so I think that might be the anecdote. And then I think the question is, what does the data bear out? And is that true or not? And the data and the relationship with the anecdote is always the most interesting when it disproves the hypothesis, because you might hear that a lot, but in reality, it's a fairly minor number of occasions where that's happening. And in many cases, the anecdote bears that out. And in truth, in this case, 75% of SES are selected from within the same agency and the same subcomponent. And only 8% are coming into the SES from the private sector. So when you look at the data, it actually bears true with some of the anecdotes that might have been heard. But I think it's always kind of going back and forth between the personal experience that folks may be sharing stories about and some of the data that could either reflect that that's true or not true, and the relationship between those two as you're presenting this information to decision makers.
And the hypothesis generating question is really important, but trying to figure out how to communicate data is also. Just a quick point, what percentage of people are hired in the SES from within the agency? So it's sort of hard to have that number stick. Lisa just mentioned it, but it's really hard to have it stick in, and stories stick much better. But if you think about it, what is it that statistics tell us? Because we say, well, we don't want to be sloppy, and anecdotes are just the lazy man's or lazy woman's way out of this. But if you think about what it is that a statistic is, it's a kind of some kind of measure of central tendency or measure of trend. It's a way to try to take a big collection of data and try to condense it into something you can communicate. And that's what you want to try to do. But the problem is it's hard to remember. It's hard to focus on. What is an anecdote? It could be a story that either has nothing to do with what the data say, but what if we focused on using anecdotes that captured, for example, the central tendency of the data, the same way that a mean or a median would? If you use stories in ways that capture and tell the story about the central tendency of the data, then you have a valid basis on which to be able to make the communication in a way that reinforces the statistics and underlines and reinforces what the statistics are trying to tell us. So rather than being a kind of lazy way around trying to do careful analysis, it can be a way of reinforcing it. It can also be a way of saying, somebody's telling a story, is this characteristic or not of the program? And if it turns out that, well, I know that so-and-so was hired from outside, well, if it turns out to be only 8%, then yes, it's true in 8% of the time, but you have a way of being able to separate out the stories that people hear and that stick in their mind from the things that represent the kind of general descriptions of what's going on. And that's very important. Most politicians I know operate on the basis of stories that they hear. They have interactions with constituents, they have interactions with customers, they have things that stick in their mind, they have problems they want to solve, and for the most part it's based on anecdotes. That's not likely to change. Some politicians I know are great at just latching on to data and just live on it. I was telling Lisa before the meeting, I actually watched Governor O'Malley of Maryland one time give a presentation of state stat where he was clicking through the slides and looking at the data and said, wait a minute, this number changed from yesterday. There aren't many politicians like that. Most politicians operate on the stories that they hear, and it's a whole lot better to make sure that the stories that they remember and the stories that they tell represent what it is that the data reinforce. People will communicate and remember on the basis of the stories, and if you can find ways of reinforcing the data and the stories together, then you have a way of being able to have a powerful method of communication.
I would say also it's about knowing your audience. So in the O'Malley example, or I worked a lot with Sean Donovan, if you just use data, they'd be very happy because that's the way they think and that's what's most compelling. And you've probably all heard the examples of people who the data will be compelling to them, and another set of people, they really don't care about that. They really want to know the personal story and the individual case example of what's happened. And ideally, you have a mix of the two, and I think, as Don is saying, that reinforce one another. But I think probably the most important thing is knowing your audience, and does the decision maker, what are they more likely to be responsive to, and how can you structure the presentation or the information in a way that appeals to that?
And that is a great segue also into the kind of one of the key learnings I think that these guys doing the presentations today have really come away with, not to steal our thunder because they'll talk about it later. I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions. So first off, if anyone in the audience has any questions for any of us on the panel, you're welcome to either put your hand up, or there's actually a podium sort of halfway back on the room where you have a mic that is on that you can go and stand up, but we need you to speak into a mic so people on the phones can hear. So, any questions? Kevin, I'm going to let you have this.
So I'm very curious if the panel will comment on our experience, which is that when a decision maker asks for more data, and then asks for more data, and asks for more data, they're usually trying to get out of making the decision that you want. And we've certainly found that stories are very powerful in doing this, but it's sort of like, is there a common theme about data and data analytics that leads you to think about a different way of presenting data? Is there something that we can learn about sort of this rebuff or decision postponement process? Because decisions take a long time to make. That's.
Can we take one more question?
Hi. Usually when you're presenting to a mixed group. Some like the data, some like the personal stories. Have you found, this might sound like a chicken or egg sort of thing, but have you found that it's better to tell the story first and then show the corroborating data? Or do you like to show the data and then tell a story about it?
Do we have any questions on the, if anyone on the phone wants to ask a question, please type it into the message board. Are there any on there yet? No? Okay, so do. So shall we, any more questions from the audience? Lane, would you mind going up to that podium? And as you do, why don't we take those first two? Anyone want to?
A couple of quick thoughts to pull these together. It's important to remember that what we're talking about is communication to begin with. It's not just, here's the answer, and going up to the mountaintop and putting down a flag and saying this is the answer. It's important to remember that even Moses, with the answer inscribed in stone tablets from God, was not successful in convincing the people he was bringing the tablets to follow what it is that God said. It took 2 efforts and a second draft. And so, and for those of you who remember your Exodus or your Charlton Heston movie. So it's about communication, it's about persuasion, and it's about the form in which the communication happens. And it's terribly important to try to think about the audience and about how you're going to communicate things, but it's also important, I think, to get a sense from the way, watching the way that other folks do it. If you think about what it is that seems to stick, what is it the journalists seem to do? You see that it's often the case that there will be a story of some kind that sort of kicks the story off at the beginning to try to say, here's what it's all about, to try to grab the attention, and then going into things later. So the answer to the question about how best to communicate is not always, but often, a way to try to start with a story, to start with something that will sort of stick in people's mind, to sort of get their attention, and then try to reinforce it. But of course, then if it turns out that I'm not convinced yet, there are sort of, sometimes what's going on is that I haven't yet heard what I want to hear, or if I keep asking for more information, maybe I can put off making a decision. There are alternative ways of being able to portray stories and communicate it. Again, it's about communication, it's about persuasion, and sometimes if one form doesn't work, another one does. And one of the things that we're moving to is an increasing effort to try to go from basic descriptive statistics to trends and graphs and Excel charts, going from there to GIS and efforts to try to portray things that way, photos or pictures. Think about what you've seen already and what is it will stick, whether it's Sophia's poor office and all that paper overwhelming. That if you want to understand the importance of making the transition from paper to electronic records, all you have to do is remember the picture of Sophia's office. And that communicates powerfully about that. So it's a matter of understanding the audience, understanding maybe somebody may not want to make a decision, and asking for more information may be a way of dealing with it, but there are different patterns of communication that may turn out to be persuasive, and you will understand perhaps what's the key that turns the lock, that opens the door, that produces the decision.
Yeah, I would just say that kind of a big part of story and a big part of the decision I think that you're aiming for is the urgency and how you communicate that. And I think coming back to, I think of a kind of recent example around this, there's been a lot of analysis around Social Security disability claims. And there's a huge backlog, over 1 million people who are waiting for adjudication of those claims. So it's been studied a lot, and how do we make it better? So if I were in that situation, I think it would be really trying to paint a picture of the people who are not getting paid those claims and who are suffering every month, or quantifying it in some way. And I think getting the decision maker to emotionally connect with the results of not making that decision and with that problem. Which is hard to do, I think, but often is the story. X number of people are here, not getting paid even though they've been out on disability, et cetera. So I think it's a tough, kind of the inertia of large organizations and the inability to make that decision, I think is tough. But coming back to the urgency and dissatisfaction, what is the pain point and how do we emphasize that? And I think to your question about, which comes first, my experience, and I don't know how many people read The New Yorker, but I always am drawn in by the first story that's told, and I kind of think, I have really no interest or knowledge of this, and then I'm like, wow, this seems really compelling, and then I read all the stats. Whereas in some of the stat conversations I've had, I think sometimes starting with the stat, like only 8% of SES are hired from outside of the federal government, that's actually pretty compelling. Whoa, I didn't realize that. That pulls you in. So I think, again, it depends on the audience and the environment. I think I get more credibility when I start that way in government. I think in The New Yorker, you pull in a reader more quickly with a personal story. So I think it depends on the audience.
Lane, I don't want to deprive you of your opportunity to ask a question, so go ahead and then we'll have to wrap up.
Sure. One of the things, as these policy decisions are very complex. They involve a lot of different stakeholders. Can be very complicated, and also given that stories are picked up very well, people can sink their teeth into them and they can almost have a life of their own. How do you balance, which statistics are you putting forward so that way the story is accurately capturing kind of the nuance and the gravity of the situation while kind of bringing it to a spotlight as well? How do you strike and get consensus behind what is being told?
And Kathy, we've got one from the phones too. Do you want to just summarize those as well?
Oh, sure. So they're a little bit different. The first one talks about how companies use narratives in their annual reports when they're communicating very distinct financial data, results data, and then writing that around their corporate goodness and so on. As somebody wants to address that. And the second one is actually very, very specific to our particular audience, asking that when senior managers do not trust data or they critique it for being manipulatable, that was a great word to use early, how do you grow internal trust within your hierarchy with performance data?
And in a sense, I think these are, in a way, all different parts of the same question. And so two different sides to it. On the one side, there is a kind of, at least I will say in the academic world, there's a kind of conceit that says if you sit down and you study the problem and you come out with the data and you come out with the conclusions that this is what the answer is. And it turns out, of course, that that's never the case. You never have enough data. You never have enough evidence. You can never be sure exactly about what the data says. And you can never very clearly communicate the entire richness of everything, no matter how long a piece that you write, because it's complicated. And people will never find a way to make that stick, which gets to the problem of trust. You've got to have some way to be able to communicate the core essence of it, which is why we use, for example, statistics that try to summarize complex data that says, well, where's the middle and how much variance is there, what are the trends and other things of that sort. So we use statistics, but then, well, I don't trust that because the data are cooked or they're manipulated or they're values. Well, of course they're values. They're values in everything. There's even a value in using certain kind of statistics as opposed to telling stories, and there's a value that's laden in understanding that we're telling stories instead of using statistics. Of course, there are always values, and which is why corporations in their annual reports try to understand what values they're trying to communicate that reinforce the data that they have underlying it. It is always about communication, it's about persuasion, it's about emotions, it's about why it matters, it's about what is the question to which this is the answer, and understanding that there's no communication that's possible that doesn't have some element of values laden inside it. And so the key is transparency, being clear what it is that the values are, about trying to be clear about how sure you are about the data. NASA's had problems where they've had problems and decisions before launches about whether or not it was safe to launch or not. And there's never a sure thing. Sometimes worries have been higher than others, and sometimes the people in charge of communicating have not been successful about communicating how sure they were about that. So it's a matter of understanding that in the end, the conceit that often comes from the academic community that, well, we're sure about what this is, we're never sure. It's always a matter of values. It's always a matter about communication and emotion, and the key to it is being transparent and clear about how sure we are, what the problem is, what the question is, what the answer is, and what answer we're trying to provide, and the kind of connection that we make to the problems that decision makers need to solve.
I would just maybe end with one quick story, or actually kind of a joke that I think reflects a little bit of some of those questions that were asked, which is the man who lost his keys and is on his hands and knees looking for them, and someone comes along and says, "Oh, what's happened?" And he says, "Oh, I've lost my keys." And he's under kind of a street lamp, and the person says, "Oh, well, did you lose is this where you lost them?" And he said, "Oh no, I lost them over there, far, a little ways away, but this is where the light is." And I think it gets to the question around what data do you use. It's not the data that's just available, it's the data that's available around the problem. And I think often in government what I've seen is, well, okay, we got to collect a bunch of data and have a conversation. Here's what we know. We've done X number of these trainings or this number of outputs. But we're not really thinking about this from a kind of problem-driven perspective, which I think is the key part of it. Not where's the light, but where's the problem.
We're out of time. Thank you so much for all your questions, and thank you very much to my fellow panel members. Give everyone a round of applause. Thank you.